Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Ozcast.
Right, so today we are diving into a real geopolitical puzzle. It's Colombia's balancing act in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Oh, yeah.
It's been 3 years since this thing kicked off.
Right.
And
it's a fascinating one for sure.
well, so much of the world has chosen sides, right? You're either with Ukraine or with Russia, or, at least you're picking a side.
Yeah.
But Colombia's kind of charted this different course, right? They're officially neutral.
Yeah.
And we've got a ton of articles and reports here,
Yeah.
and I'm telling you, the reality on the ground is a lot more complicated
Oh, absolutely.
than just a simple neutral label would make you think.
Yeah. I mean, what's really interesting is that Colombia is trying to maintain this neutral stance while its own citizens are actually literally fighting on the front lines and not all on the same side, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah. Plus, we're going to get into all this, but you get internal pressures.
Oh, for sure.
Global alliances are shifting. There's a lot of history here. It's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot going on. Yeah.
So to understand where Colombia is now, I guess we have to start with, kind of rewind back to the beginning of the war.
Sure.
How they reacted when things first broke out, back when Duke was president.
Yeah. Yeah. So back in February of 2022, under President Duke, Colombia came out very strong. They condemned Russia's invasion very, very clearly. In fact, Duke actually said, and this is a quote, Colombia categorically rejects the attack. This attack is not only against the sovereignty of Ukraine, but also against the integrity of its territory, a threat to world peace.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, he didn't mince words there. So it
Yeah.
sounds like they were pretty firmly on the side of Ukraine and the West at that point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they condemned the invasion. They sent humanitarian aid to Ukraine. They pretty much aligned themselves with that global outcry against what Russia was doing.
Okay. But then, of course, things got interesting, right?
Yeah.
When President Petro was elected in August of 2022, and his approach to all this has been a lot more, well, I guess you'd say neutral, to say the least.
Oh, for sure. So Petro's government, they still officially condemn the war, but the tone it's definitely different.
Yeah.
He's all about, let's find a peaceful resolution through dialogue. He urges both sides to come to the table to negotiate.
Okay, so that makes sense, right? On the surface.
Yeah.
But then he also gets on social media and openly criticizes the U.S.
Yeah.
for their role in the conflict. And even says that, the U.S., he goes so far as to say that the U.S. betrayed Ukraine in Europe.
Yeah.
And that just seems like such a risky move,
Yeah.
considering how much Colombia relies on the U.S. economically, politically.
Yeah, it's definitely a bold move, I would say. It seems to indicate that Petro's trying to position Colombia as a more independent voice on the world stage. Maybe even hinting at a shift away from those traditional alliances
Interesting.
with the United States.
Okay, so is he trying to play both sides here?
Well, I wouldn't.
Condemn the war, but also criticize U.S. involvement.
I don't know if it's as simple as playing both sides. I mean, I think his actions seem to be pointing more towards this non-aligned stance.
Okay.
He's really pushing those peace talks and a diplomatic solution.
Okay.
He's really trying to distance Colombia from those escalating tensions between the U.S. and Russia.
But isn't that a really tough position to maintain, especially with, Trump back in office?
Yeah.
And taking this very pro-Russia stance.
You're right.
Doesn't that just complicate things for Petro and for Colombia even more?
Oh, it definitely adds another layer of complexity
Yeah.
to an already complex situation. Trump's return and his more favorable view of Russia really creates a new set of challenges for Petro's balancing act.
Okay. So we've got, Petro advocating for neutrality
Right.
and dialogue while also distancing himself from the U.S., which is,
A traditional ally.
a traditional ally.
Yeah.
And then you've got Trump back in the picture, and he's aligning himself more with Putin.
Right.
And all this while, of course, the war is still raging on.
Exactly.
This is a lot to unpack.
It is. It's a lot.
And then on top of all that,
Yeah.
there's this whole other issue
Right.
of Colombian mercenaries fighting in the Ukrainian army.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, which just seems wild. I mean, you've got Colombia trying to stay neutral.
Yeah.
But then you've got literally thousands of Colombians who are actively fighting in the conflict.
Yeah, it's estimated that over 2,000 Colombians have joined the Ukrainian forces, and about 300 of them have been killed in the fighting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it really, it just highlights that human cost of this war, and how it's impacting countries way beyond Ukraine's borders.
Yeah. It seems like such a, I don't know, contradiction, right? Colombia is officially neutral, but you've got all these citizens fighting for Ukraine.
It's a real head scratcher for sure.
Yeah. So why, I mean, what's the story there? Why are so many Colombians choosing to get involved in a war that doesn't really seem to directly involve their country?
Well, that's where it gets really, really interesting. A lot of these fighters, they're ex-military.
Okay.
Who've they've struggled to find their footing back in civilian life.
Yeah.
Colombia's got this long history of internal conflict.
Right.
And for a lot of soldiers, that transition back to a peaceful life can be incredibly, incredibly difficult.
So are they mainly motivated by the money then? I mean, are we talking about, economic hardship pushing them to become mercenaries?
Money is definitely a factor, but I don't think it's the whole story. I think there's a sense of displacement. There's a lack of opportunity back home, and maybe even a yearning for that camaraderie.
Oh yeah.
And the purpose that they found in the military.
I see.
And then suddenly there's this conflict, and it's offering them a chance to use those skills.
Yeah.
To earn a living, to regain some of that sense of belonging.
So it's like they're products of Colombia's past, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shaped by conflict.
Shaped by conflict. Yeah.
And now that same past is pushing them into a new conflict.
Yeah.
One that's shaping the whole global landscape.
Exactly. Yeah. It's this powerful reminder that global events, they have these really real human consequences.
Yeah. For
these Colombian mercenaries, the war in Ukraine isn't some abstract political game.
Right.
This is their reality. This is their struggle for survival. And for some, tragically, it's their final chapter.
And it definitely adds another layer. I mean, just to come back to that, another layer of complexity to Colombia's, delicate balancing act.
Oh, for sure.
Because how do you maintain neutrality when your own people are entangled in the conflict, fighting, for one side, even if it's unofficial?
Yeah. It's incredibly difficult. It really highlights, how difficult of a position he's in. He's trying to appease different factions, both within Colombia and internationally.
Right.
He's advocating for peace and dialogue, but he's also got to think about, the interests of his own citizens, even those that have chosen to take up arms in a foreign war. It's a tightrope walk, very, very high stakes.
Yeah, I'm starting to understand why this whole situation has been described as a real geopolitical puzzle.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of pieces here, and it's not clear how they all fit together just yet.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've established, Colombia's initial response to the war, the shift under Petro, the impact of Trump's return, the presence of the Colombian mercenaries. But to really get it, to really grasp what all this means for Colombia, we need to dig a little deeper.
Okay.
We need to look at Petro's strategy and its potential implications.
Yeah. I'm definitely curious to see how this whole balancing act plays out.
Yeah.
I mean, what are the potential risks or rewards of his approach?
That's a great question.
I mean, can he pull it off in the long run?
Yeah.
What are the chances of him actually bringing about
a
peaceful solution to all this?
Yeah. I mean, those are all excellent questions, and we'll explore those in more detail as we continue this deep dive. But I think before we get into the nitty-gritty of Petro's strategy and the potential consequences, I think it'd be helpful to just kind of recap what we've learned so far.
Okay, yeah, let's synthesize a little bit.
Yeah.
We've got Colombia in this incredibly tricky position.
Yeah.
They're officially neutral in a war that's dividing the world. But at the same time, they're dealing with their own internal challenges, and global alliances are constantly shifting.
Right. I mean, it's almost like trying to walk across a tightrope during an earthquake.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then to make it even more complicated, you've got Colombian citizens actively fighting in the war.
Right.
Which is a stark reminder that even a seemingly distant conflict can have these really real, tangible impacts on people, on individuals and nations, way beyond, the immediate battleground.
And we've also seen how President Petro is trying to navigate this incredibly complex landscape, advocating for these peace talks, a diplomatic solution. At the same time, he's also trying to maintain and maybe even redefine Colombia's strategic relationships.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, there's the wild card of Trump being back in the White House.
Yeah.
And his pro-Russia stance.
Yeah.
It just adds a whole other layer of uncertainty to the whole equation.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's a very delicate dance.
Yeah.
And Petro's going to have to, execute it with incredible finesse if he hopes to succeed. I mean, the stakes are very high. And the outcome of his balancing act could have, profound consequences, not just for Colombia, but potentially for the whole region.
So the big question that remains then is what does the future hold for Colombia in this geopolitical tug of war? Can they actually maintain this neutrality? I mean, is it even a viable strategy in the long run? Or will they be forced to choose a side eventually?
Yeah.
And what would that even mean for the broader region?
Right. Those are the key questions we'll be tackling next as we delve deeper into this fascinating case study of global politics in action.
Okay. So stay with us.
Yeah.
As we continue this deep dive into Colombia's, high stakes balancing act.
Absolutely.
In this war in Ukraine.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
We'll be back soon to explore the potential consequences of Colombia's neutrality and what their decision could mean for the future of Latin America.
For sure.
All right, we'll be back in just a moment.
We'll be back.
We're back, and, as we're looking through all these sources, one thing that really jumps out at me is this human element of it all. I mean, we're talking about Colombian mercenaries literally putting their lives on the line.
Right.
In Ukraine, a country thousands of miles away from home. What makes someone make that choice?
It's a good question, and it really goes beyond just the paycheck, I think.
Okay.
Although that's definitely part of it.
Yeah.
The sources really paint a picture of these individuals being kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. A lot of them are former military, struggling to reintegrate into civilian life after years of dealing with conflict in Colombia itself.
So they're coming from a background that's already marked by conflict, by instability.
Right.
And then they face limited opportunities back home.
Right.
And then there's this, allure of using their skills in a new conflict zone. Mm-hmm. It's almost like a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it really is. And I think for some of these mercenaries, the war in Ukraine, it represents a chance to escape their circumstances, a chance to earn a living, and maybe even find a sense of purpose that's missing back home.
Okay.
It's a reminder that these global conflicts they have these ripple effects that extend far beyond that immediate war zone, and they're touching people's lives in ways that we don't always think about.
So does this say something then about Colombia's role in the broader world?
It's a good question.
I mean, are we looking at a sign of things to come? I mean, you've got this history of internal conflict in Colombia.
Right.
This large pool of ex-military personnel.
Yeah.
Could Colombia become like a breeding ground for mercenaries in future conflicts?
I mean, it's a question that policymakers in Colombia are wrestling with right now. It's not a label that any nation wants.
Right.
But the sources do suggest that Colombia has a history of this, right? Of its citizens participating in conflicts overseas. I mean, you even see examples of Colombian mercenaries popping up in places like Sudan.
Wow.
Well before the current conflict in Ukraine.
So this isn't a new phenomenon.
No, it's not a new phenomenon.
This has been going on for a while.
Yeah.
But it definitely complicates Petro's efforts, right?
Oh, absolutely.
To present Colombia as this neutral player.
Yeah, it definitely undermines that image of a nation that's committed to peace and dialogue. When you've got a significant number of your citizens actively engaged in armed conflict.
So let's shift gears a little bit, bring this back to Petro's strategy.
Okay.
I mean, we've talked about his emphasis on neutrality, on dialogue.
Yeah.
But how realistic is that?
It's a big question.
I mean, really, with the world becoming more and more polarized,
Mm.
can Colombia truly stay?
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Stay neutral
Right.
in the long run?
It's a huge gamble, to be honest. The sources really highlight how precarious
Yeah.
this whole balancing act is. On
Yeah.
the one hand, you've got Petro's call for dialogue, for a peaceful resolution, and that resonates with a lot of people, especially in a region that's so often been caught in the crossfire of global power struggle.
Why? So it could elevate Colombia's standing, right? I mean, they
Yeah.
could position themselves
Yeah.
as this leader in promoting peace and stability in the region.
Right, exactly. But then on the other hand, maintaining neutrality in a world where those alliances are hardening, it's incredibly difficult. You know, his criticism of the U.S., while it is bold, it carries some real risks. I mean, it could alienate a key ally,
Right.
and create some economic vulnerabilities for Colombia.
And then, of course, there's Trump,
Right.
right, who's back in the White House,
Back in the picture.
openly aligning himself with Putin.
Yeah.
I mean, that throws a whole other wrench into the works.
Oh, it does.
I mean, how do you navigate neutrality when one of your most important allies is essentially siding with the aggressor in the conflict you're trying to stay neutral in?
It's a tough one. There are no easy answers. Petro's trying to thread a very fine needle.
Yeah.
He needs to maintain some level of cooperation with the U.S., but also assert Colombia's independence,
Right.
and avoid getting too entangled in this escalating tension between the U.S. and Russia.
So what are the options here?
Oh,
Is he walking into a dead end with this neutrality strategy?
Right.
Is he going to have to pick a side eventually?
It's possible. I mean, there's no crystal ball.
Yeah.
But if you look at the sources, a few potential scenarios emerge. One possibility is that Petro just continues walking this tightrope, hoping that the war will wind down eventually, and the pressure to choose sides diminishes.
Yeah.
But that's a risky bet.
Right.
It relies on factors that are largely outside of his control.
Okay, so what are the other possibilities? I mean, what if the pressure just becomes too much?
Well, if Colombia's forced to choose, I mean, they essentially have two paths.
Okay.
They could lean further towards the U.S. and its allies, solidifying that traditional alliance.
Yeah.
But that risks further alienating Russia and potentially becoming a target of their aggression,
Yeah.
either directly or through proxies.
And I imagine that wouldn't go over very well with a lot of Colombians.
No, not at all. You know, there's a strong anti-imperialist sentiment in a lot of parts of Latin America,
Right.
including Colombia.
Yeah.
So aligning too closely with the U.S. could trigger internal backlash,
Okay.
fuel social unrest.
So that leaves the other option, which is aligning with Russia. I mean, that just seems
Right.
even more far-fetched,
Right.
given the international condemnation
Mm-hmm.
and the potential economic and political fallout.
Right. It would be highly controversial. It would isolate Colombia on the world stage.
Yeah.
Damage relationships with key trading partners. Plus, aligning with Russia, it could also strain relations with their neighbors in the region.
Right. A lot of whom have condemned the invasion.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it seems like every path is just fraught with risk.
It is. It's a real dilemma.
Is there any way out of this geopolitical maze, or is Colombia just destined to be caught in the crosshairs?
Right.
No matter what they do.
Well, there is one more scenario that we haven't considered.
Okay.
It's a little bit more ambitious, and some might even say idealistic.
All right. I'm intrigued.
Okay, so imagine Colombia not just as a neutral observer,
Okay.
but as an active mediator in this conflict.
Oh, wow.
A bridge builder between these warring factions.
Yeah.
Leveraging their neutral status
Okay.
to facilitate dialogue.
Yeah.
And really push for that peaceful resolution.
I mean, that's a pretty bold idea.
It is.
I mean, do you think Petro has has the clout to pull that off.
Yeah. Is there anything in the sources that even suggests he's considering this? I mean, it's definitely a long shot.
Yeah.
But there are hints of this ambition in his rhetoric and his actions.
Okay.
He's already shown that he's willing to challenge the status quo. Criticize the U.S., call for a negotiated settlement.
Right.
So if he plays his cards right, he could potentially position Colombia as a key player in this whole peace process.
Yeah.
Earn international recognition, solidify their leadership in the region.
So instead of being forced to choose a side,
Right.
they could carve out this whole other role for themselves
Exactly.
as peacemakers, this neutral ground where dialogue can actually happen.
Right.
It's a gamble for sure.
It is.
But one with potentially huge payoffs.
Huge payoffs, yeah. It's a high-risk, high-reward scenario.
Yeah.
It would require very skillful diplomacy, strategic alliances, and probably a bit of luck.
Yeah.
But if successful, it could completely transform Colombia's, image on the world stage.
Yeah.
And potentially even contribute to a more peaceful resolution to this whole conflict.
Okay. So we've kind of laid out the potential scenarios here.
Right.
The risks, the rewards of each path.
Yeah.
But which way is Colombia likely to go?
Yeah.
I mean, what does their future hold in this global landscape that's constantly in flux?
It's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we don't have a crystal ball.
Right.
But what we can do is look at the trends, the motivations, the historical context, and try to make some educated guesses about what the future might hold.
Well, I'm eager to hear your analysis.
Yeah.
So let's dive into those possibilities and try to make sense of this complex and evolving situation. Okay, so we're back, and I think the big question that we're left with is, what does the future hold for Colombia as this war in Ukraine just drags on and on? And we've talked about those potential paths, right? Sticking with neutrality, maybe aligning more with the U.S., or even taking that risky step of aligning with Russia. But, I mean, none of those options really seem all that great.
No, they don't. Each path comes with its own challenges and its own pitfalls, right?
Yeah.
It's a tough spot trying to, navigate this global conflict while also safeguarding its own interests, its own stability.
I mean, we talked about the intriguing idea of Colombia maybe taking on this mediator role.
Yeah.
Working towards a peaceful solution.
Right.
Do you really think Petro could pull that off?
I mean, it's definitely ambitious.
Yeah.
But I don't think we should write it off entirely.
Okay.
If you look at the sources, there are some factors that are working in his favor.
Okay.
First of all, he's already established this reputation as, sort of a maverick.
Yeah.
A leader, willing to challenge the status quo, speak his mind. And I think that gives him a certain amount of credibility on the world stage.
So he's not afraid to ruffle some feathers.
No.
And that could actually be an asset in this kind of situation.
Exactly. He's not beholden to those traditional alliances or diplomatic niceties. And then secondly, Colombia's geographic location, their historical ties to both the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah.
I think those give them a unique perspective. They're not firmly in either camp.
Right.
Which could make them more acceptable as that neutral go-between.
And didn't they also play a similar role, like a mediator role?
They did.
In some regional conflicts?
Yeah.
I vaguely remember, I think it was something with Venezuela. Weren't they involved in some peace talks there?
They were. They have a history of mediating conflicts in Latin America, which could give them some valuable experience and credibility in approaching this Russia-Ukraine situation. They understand the nuances of regional dynamics, the importance of finding common ground.
So let's say Petro goes all in on this mediator role. Yeah. What would that even look like? I mean, what steps could he take to actually make that a reality?
I mean, it would take a very carefully orchestrated diplomatic offensive. She'd have to reach out to both sides in the conflict, really emphasize Colombia's neutrality, their sincere desire for a peaceful resolution.
Yeah.
He could leverage existing, diplomatic channels, maybe even propose hosting peace talks on neutral ground in Colombia.
But wouldn't he need support from other countries?
Oh, for sure.
I mean, it seems like a lot
Oh, yeah.
for Colombia to take on.
it would be too much.
By themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. He would have to build a coalition of like-minded nations. He would have to rally support from, other Latin American countries, maybe some in Europe or Asia who share this vision of a negotiated settlement.
Yeah.
And the more international backing that he can get, the more leverage he'll have when he approaches Russia and Ukraine.
It sounds like it sounds like a really delicate balancing act.
Oh, yeah.
He has to maintain that neutrality,
Right.
avoid alienating either side, but also build enough momentum to make this whole peace process a real possibility.
It's a high wire act.
Yeah.
But the potential rewards are huge.
Yeah.
I mean, if he can pull this off, it wouldn't just solidify Colombia's position as a regional leader. It could put them on the global stage as this champion for peace, for diplomacy. It could reshape their image, strengthen relationships with countries all over the world.
It's a pretty compelling vision.
It is.
But it's also a very, very challenging path. So, I mean, what do you see as the biggest obstacles here?
I think the biggest hurdle is just that deep mistrust between Russia and Ukraine and their allies, Convincing them to actually come to the negotiating table in good faith, I mean, it's going to be incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
Especially with the fighting still going on.
Right.
The human cost of the war just mounting every day.
And then there's the U.S., right?
Yeah.
And Trump with his pro-Russia stance.
Yeah.
I mean, that just adds
another wrinkle
to this whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Petro would have to be, very careful in how he manages that relationship, making it clear that Colombia is acting on their own, not as a proxy for any one side. He'd have to convince the U.S. that a negotiated settlement, it's in everyone's best interest, even if it means, making some concessions that maybe don't align with their current stance.
So it's a long shot, but it's not entirely impossible.
No.
It would take skillful diplomacy. It would take political maneuvering, maybe a bit of luck.
And some luck. Yeah.
But if it works, it could really change Colombia's place in the world.
It really could. It really could. And that's what makes this whole story so fascinating. I think we're seeing a country at a crossroads here, faced with these really complex choices, each with its own risks and rewards. Right. And whatever they decide, it could have consequences not just for them, but for the region, maybe even for the global balance of power.
It's a reminder that even in a world that seems so polarized, there's always room for these unexpected players to emerge, shake things up.
Right.
I mean, Colombia's, a relatively small country.
Right.
But their actions in this conflict could have these ripple effects far beyond their borders.
Yeah, and that's the point we want to leave you with. Keep an eye on Colombia, their choices in the coming months and years. I mean, those could give us some valuable insights into the shifting dynamics of global power, the role that smaller nations play in shaping that international order, and really that enduring human desire for peace in the face of conflict.
Yeah, it's a story that's still unfolding.
For sure.
And we're going to be following it closely here on the Deep Dive.
I will.
So until next time, stay curious.
Yeah.
Stay informed, and keep diving deep into the complexities of our world.
Ozcast.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.